What is up, y'all? It is your girl Jice, and we are back with another episode of Boss Up with BBI. So I am a little bit on edge about today's topic. So before I jump in, because when I jump in, I'm going in. I wanted to start off by reminding you that this is a place where we are talking about all things money and mindset in the Black community. Today, specifically mindset. But of course, we know that all things within our world pretty much tie back into economics and money, right? So, although we're not going to really dig into money issues today, I want you to think about how this relates to the economy and what that's going to look like on a long-term basis. So anyway, that's just a little bit of like where we're going. Just know that this is like really heavily on mindset today. But this has been on my heart for a little while, pretty much since I have been watching these things with the coronavirus or COVID-19 begin to unfold. I have really wanted to have this conversation. I thought about doing it as a live show. So if you are not familiar, you can always go over to YouTube and subscribe to our YouTube at CTN Media. And where I do some shows live. And I thought about doing this live, and then I decided to come back and have this conversation this way so that I could just really kind of dig into my thought process, and then hopefully through your comments, through any feedback that you leave, that we can engage and I can figure out what's the best way to have additional conversations around this, because it's one thing to talk about this in theory. It's another thing to be sitting in the middle of this and kind of watching things play out and thinking about what this looks like for the Black community long term. So I guess let me get out some of my other little pieces that need to happen. Make sure that you like and subscribe. Make sure that you share this information out, whether you agree, whether you disagree, whatever the case is. I'm always here for, strong dialogue, conversation, things that just get us thinking, things that get us thinking outside of, the norm, right? And someone recently posted somewhere on a comment, and it was like, people who are not conspiracy theorists believe in CNN, right? And people who are conspiracy theorists, they do research. And I laughed when I read that, because I thought, how interesting. The more research that you do, it's difficult to not see a deeper level or multiple layers of things that are happening in our society. And it's true that sometimes it can be difficult to decipher what's real, what's not, what's true, what is propaganda, what is, just false information, or whatever the case might be. But the more that you dig, the more that you find that what we are seeing on the surface is just not the case. So that being said, again, just like and subscribe, share this information out, because this really is around conversation. And what we're doing here is around how we have, intellectual conversations around things that affect our communities. The other thing that I want to remind you is that you are listening to the Boss Up with BBI podcast on CTN Media, where we are changing the narrative. And so feel free, please do support independent Black media. And you can do that if you are listening on Anchor. We have a donate button. If you are listening on YouTube, you can also donate as well. So check the description box, and there are ways that you can donate to our platform so that we can keep bringing you independent media. But also in these times, a lot of the programs and a lot of the work that we do is event-based, is program-based. So our work is certainly affected. I usually don't make a big habit out of, saying to give and to donate and that. But I am going to say that if you're able to, we would love your donation. We absolutely always love your support. There are multiple ways that you can get involved with the Black Business Initiative, with this podcast, and with other ways that we promote out, whether it's via our newsletter, whether it's via our social media channels, whether it is in across our live shows. And we have other networks and platforms that we work with, including the Brother Jeff Network. So there are other ways that you can also promote out, whether you want to sponsor some of the things that we're doing, whether you want to donate or a combination of the two. But in all cases, we are out here for our community. We are not a nonprofit organization, although we do have a nonprofit arm. So if you want to donate, we do have links that you can donate and get that tax deduction. But the other, thing that you can do is support organizations that are out here for our community. So that is my pitch to you. That is my ask of you. And I want to dig in, y'all. So I'm talking today about propaganda. And one, propaganda is a word that we use. It's actually not a word that we use often, but when I say propaganda, or when people say propaganda, you will have all the wokey wokes come out and like attest to, what propaganda looks like, right? And I don't even mean to say that in a condescending way. It's just sometimes interesting to me because you have people who are very intelligent, and sometimes people who are woke, and yet they still really misconstrue what propaganda is or how it's used and what it looks like. And so I don't really want to get into what it's not. I really want to dig into what it is, but I do want to acknowledge briefly that propaganda is like much more than advertisement. It's more than selling something, right? This is a tactic that is used to influence. So there are a lot of definitions for propaganda. There are a lot of usefulness, ways that propaganda can be useful, I should say. But where do we see propaganda being used, and specifically where it can be used in a way that can be harmful, or that can really influence what's happening in society on a large scale? So I made a post a little while ago talking about like large scale and long-term propaganda and thinking about the idea of the long game. First of all, our community does not think about the long game. So that part in and of itself is one thing that we need to really adjust inside of our community and inside of our thought process. We don't spend time thinking about the long game, but we should really understand that the powers that be that are extractive, violent, forceful, have spent time thinking about the long game. So where we're really beginning to have these conversations around intergenerational wealth, these are not conversations around intergenerational wealth, right? Like, you're not going to, like, the Bill Gates of the world, the Jeff Bezos of the world, like, they're not going to lose all their wealth. They're not going to be penniless, right? They have already built intergenerational wealth. Those are not their conversations. Now it's about preserving legacy. It's about changing the world. It's about policy and legislation on large scales. It's about controlling economies, controlling currencies, controlling governments, right? Controlling these bigger outcomes, industries, far past how can I make sure that my kids don't start off at the bottom, right? So understand that there are conversations that are happening around us that are talking about the long game, and those are not conversations that in a lot of cases that we're having. And so I want to acknowledge that, because there are a lot of places where propaganda can be useful, and that we can use propaganda to, change the way that we think, sway opinions, and et cetera, but also recognizing that there are bigger things that are at play. And oftentimes it's like a bait and switch, right? So when you look at like magic tricks, what we have come to know, or what most adults come to know, is that magic tricks are really around illusion and where you draw attention. So if I'm drawing your attention up here and you don't see what I'm doing over here, or if I make you look what this hand is doing, but I'm not showing you what this hand is doing, those are ways that we are wowed and amazed, or our focus and our attention is over here without seeing what's happening over here in the peripheral. And specifically, when we only have partial information, which so many of us have, including myself. So it's not that I, have access to some additional information. It's just, one, I try to dig deeper for information. I try to vet the sources of the information. And what you find when you start doing that is that there's oftentimes a rabbit hole of information. So you can literally keep clicking and clicking and clicking and clicking. And so, it can get to be overwhelming, but also there's a place to where you can't just take what's at the surface level, because there's so many other pieces and so much other information that is there under the surface that we don't know and we're not looking for. So as I mentioned, let me circle back around to acknowledging that there are many definitions for propaganda. So let me not make it seem like this definition that I'm getting ready to give you is the one and only, but it is the one that I think, in my opinion, that fits. It fits the best, and that kind of embodies or encompasses where I see propaganda being used frequently inside of our communities. So propaganda is the mass suggestion or influence through clever or skilled use of images, slogans, and symbols that play on prejudice and emotions. So let me say that again. Propaganda is the mass suggestion or influence through clever or skilled use of images, slogans, and symbols that play on prejudice and emotions. And what I think that we should keep in mind is that, first of all, it's a mass suggestion or an influence. It is very skilled. It uses things that we continue to remember, slogans, images, symbolism, and it not only preys upon the things that we already believe to be true, which are prejudices, but also our emotions. And in that, it can direct not only our attitudes towards things, but also our actions. The way that propaganda is often used is, we're in this sense, let me back that up. So you can use propaganda to influence and suggest. And at times there are reasons, and even good reasons, to do this, right? And oftentimes you have to meet propaganda campaign with propaganda campaign. So if you have, people trying to go left and you have people trying to go right, understand that both people have an agenda, both groups have an agenda, and they are trying to get you to go which way they want you to go. And they're both going to use the power of mass suggestion and influence. They're going to be clever about it. They're going to use images, symbols, slogans. They're going to prey upon your prejudices and prey upon your emotions in order to direct your actions and in order to direct your attitudes in the direction that they want you to go. Part of that is going to be through your prejudices, right? So again, just kind of the things that you already believe. And so prejudices is one way to put those beliefs, but let me use the word beliefs so that we can so I can expand upon where this is going, right? So if you believe that the sky is blue, then it's easy for them to, talk about how, they're trying to change the sky from being blue to red, right? And you're like, oh no, you don't change the sky from being blue to red. The sky is blue, right? But you already believe the sky is blue. So you believe it should be blue. And so you don't want nobody to change it from blue because that is a belief that you hold. And it is easier to sway you based off of that belief. If you believe that the sky is purple and they're trying to convince you that they want to change it to blue, you are like, what are y'all talking about? Like, don't change that to blue. It's supposed to be purple, right? So my point is that people can hear two different propagandas, and what you believe is going to really help direct you in where you're going. So that belief part is important. Let's stick a pin in that because we're going to come back. That belief part is important. What you believe, what you already hold true to yourself is important. So part of the reason why propaganda campaigns are important, in particular when they want to do something that may get a lot of pushback, is because in order for things to move forward, specifically in a democratic type of society, right? So whether or not let's not get into the conversation about if this government is truly democratic. This is the ideals of a democratic government, which means that you vote on what you want, which essentially means that the government is supposed to move in the direction of public interest based off of what the public decides or consents to or agrees to. This is versus, say, like a dictatorship, which is like, we really don't give a fuck what you like, and this is what we're going to do, right? And so what we see happening inside of our government oftentimes is getting the majority consent to go in one way or another, right? So again, like thinking about a democratic society, we vote in order to move or give consent to move in one direction or another. And of course, it doesn't mean that you have to have 100% consent, because we don't have that, right? But it's the majority consent. That's what it's supposed to be. So again, we can talk about all the flaws of our government later, but the idea is, in a democratic sense, before you can do something that just seems or feels ridiculously heinous, you have to essentially appear to get the consent of the majority of the people. So you want to do that by gaining support, right? So it's either support to start something, it is support to maintain something, it is the support to justify something, the support to legitimize something, the support to dishearten us from something, or the support to encourage us towards something or for something. So you want to have that, ultimately you want to have that support, right? So think of anything like a bit, especially on a federal level, but really any piece of policy and legislation that they want to pass, they are working to get the appearance of support or the appearance of consent to support whatever it is, to support starting a new bill, to support maintaining a tax, to support justifying the death penalty, to support legitimizing tax cuts, right? I mean, you name it, the campaigns are there to have the appearance that there is consent here by the majority to do this XYZ thing, whatever that thing is, to start it, maintain it, justify it, legitimize it, encourage it, or discourage it. So this is why they start these propaganda campaigns. They start the process of suggesting or influencing your thoughts, suggesting or influencing your actions, suggesting or influencing your attitudes towards something. And then they base that thing, they try to influence it based off of what you believe or what they think that you believe. And if you're not quite sure what you believe, that's going to be a little bit where you're going to wrestle with some of these things. So the way that propaganda works, again, like using it as a tool for something that you want to appear to have consent for, first you're going to create like this common enemy, right? And as I'm saying these things, I want you to think about how this is being used in instances like 9/11, in instances like the coronavirus. Just think about it. So first you're going to create a common enemy. You want to direct the attention to something that you're deeming as being a negative thing, an enemy. An enemy of what, right? So the second thing is that you want to think about claiming unity, like the idea that unity around this common enemy, around neutralizing this common enemy, is what's going to bring us victory, right? And so that's when you start hearing things like, we have to stay together, we've got to be all in, it takes all of us, right? That type of language is saying we need to unify around this thing, neutralizing this thing, starting this thing, supporting this thing, doing something towards whatever this thing is that we've identified, okay? Unity. We all got to do this, guys, to make this work, right? So again, there's lots of places for propaganda. So if you go back and listen to my messaging, you hear me all day long talking about what we all got to do, the Black community, what we got to do together in order to be free, right? So so there are places where you hear propaganda that is working to suggest or influence you, yada, 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 right? Okay, so common enemy, the claim of unity is going to bring us together. This is what's going to give us the victory. It's all of us working on this together. Then it's the appeal of these culturally held ideals, okay? These culturally held ideals. That is the ideal, the culturally held ideal that life is precious, that freedom is a right, that you have, that you should have peace, right? That we should be peaceful, that you should have security, you should be safe. These are culturally held ideals, right? that exist that essentially everybody wants. Now, how you think we're going to get to life, freedom, peace, liberty, security, whatever, how you think we're going to get there is based off of your beliefs. That's based off of what you believe, what you find to be peaceful, what you find to be secure, what you find to give life or take it away. So, so create a common enemy. We're going to rally around, or we're going to unify. We're going to acknowledge that our unity is what's going to bring us victory. And what's going to bring us victory, and we're going to appeal to this sense of some very strong culturally held ideals, such as life or freedom or security. And then we're going to give you some examples. Now here's where the influence comes in, right? So this is like some of the messaging, right? There's this thing that's bad. We're all going to work together to, neutralize this thing because we want to have security. We want to be free. We want to have life, right? And life more abundantly. Then we're going to start giving you examples of how this enemy is, showing some depravity towards this in order for you to strengthen your response, right? So it's like, can you believe that, that these, let's use 9/11, right? These terrorists are out here just randomly killing people, right? There's terrorist attacks all day. There's terrorist attacks all the time on our people, right? So it's this idea that we're going to start giving you this example so that this is going to strengthen your response, that we all need to unify. It's going to take all of us together to stop these terrorist attacks. I'm specifically not using coronavirus. I just want you to think about it. But I'm specifically not using coronavirus right now, right? But just attach let's create some parallels here, because I think you're smart enough to be able to do that. Okay. So you have examples of enemy depravity to really strengthen your responsibility. Then anything unfavorable that comes out about your position on this is you're going to frame this. You're going to frame any unfavorable news or any unfavorable messaging as lies, and these lies are here to really just cost us our unity. They're here to disperse us. They're here to make sure that we are not unified, right? So all these bad things are going on. Look at this enemy. This enemy is terrible. We really have to come together to defeat this enemy in order for us to have freedom. And anything that combats that message, don't listen to that. That's just lies. And all they're trying to do is keep us from becoming unified on this against this enemy. And then what they do is they create horror stories that justify the actions that are now to come. So let's take 9/11. We have a common enemy, terrorists, specifically Middle Eastern terrorists. We're going to unify around this. We're going to come together as a country so that we can be victorious in going to war against these terrorists. Because we need to have life, freedom, and liberty and security from these terrorists. Look at what these terrorists do. Look at the way they live. They bomb people. They don't care. They pray to their Allah, and they just come on in here, and they hate us as a people. They hate Americans, and so they just come in here and they just take our lives with no remorse or no regret. Look at them. They're suicide bombers. They would die to take us down. We have to be strong about this. Oh, what is that you say? Most terrorists are white males? No, those are lies. Lies. Don't listen to that. The terrorists are Middle Eastern. They're those Arabs praying to Allah. Those are the terrorists. White men? No, that's somebody with a mental illness. That's not a terrorist. That's someone who went down the wrong path in life. God bless his heart. He's not a terrorist. That's someone who's just really patriotic and he just, couldn't express himself right. That's not a terrorist, right? Those Arabs are terrorists. Those Middle Easterns are terrorists. That's all lies, guys. Don't listen to that. Look what they did. They're out here cutting off people's heads. They're bombing people right now. Here's the horror stories to justify going to war. Is that not what happened in 9/11? It don't matter that most of the terrorist acts committed on this soil are committed by white men. That's not the story. And anytime you think about terrorists, they create a picture of Middle Eastern people. So I'm, again, specifically not using the coronavirus, but I want us to think about the way that propaganda is used and make these parallels to what we're seeing happen today. Make these parallels around how they use propaganda in order to create this narrative, in order to get you to direct your actions and your attitudes. I'm guilty of that. I went to war in Iraq, right? I was in Iraq when they said, oh, wait, guys, wait, there's no weapons of mass destruction. Like, I was literally in country. And I was like, oh, so when are we going home? And as we all know, we didn't for years and years. But this is what can happen when a narrative is created. So now I want to talk again about the long game and how some of these things have been pushed on us long enough and subtly enough in order to influence our actions in ways that don't necessarily make logical sense. So I want to still use 9/11 as an example. So think about when we first started seeing terrorist movies, not war movies, terrorist movies, specifically around terrorism, acts of terrorism on our country. So when you start seeing those pop up, you start seeing them in the late 80s, specifically terrorist movies. You can go look them up. You start seeing terrorist attack movies in the late 80s and all throughout the 90s. So now in 2001, we have a terrorist attack. And how do we behave? We behave the way that we see in the movies. In mainstream, widespread, very popular terrorist attack movies. That's the way that we behave. Not war movies, not end of the world movies, terrorist attack movies. And when they first started popping up, and then how we have behaved, right? And then think about the civil liberties that have been removed since those terrorist attacks that have never been restored. It's 20 years later, damn near 20 years later, and we have not had another terrorist attack, but very few, if any, of those civil liberties that they begin to impede on have actually been removed. So I just want you to think about when we first started seeing outbreak movies. When we first started seeing outbreak movies, there are a couple, and I mean like literally from the research that I've done, there are maybe 3 outbreak movies that are prior to the early 2000s. There's like one that has to deal with like an outbreak in the mid 70s, and then there's like 2 in the 90s. Something like that. I think it was one in the 80s and one in the 90s is actually what I think it was. But very, very few. One was like 12 Monkeys, right? With Bruce Willis, like around viruses, specifically around viruses. So now think about when you really start seeing virus movies. Like Resident Evil was probably one of the mainstream ones that came out in 2002, I believe. But for the most part, you start seeing outbreak movies, virus movies, contagion movies, like post-apocalyptic, the whole world is infected and died from a virus in the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s, like 2002, 2003, 2004 timeframe, and on up until now. So think about the reaction that we're seeing and ask yourself, is it anything like the movies? Do you feel like you are damn near living in a movie right now? And it's the timing of how long it takes to very subtly influence the way that you see something so that your reaction doesn't feel like it's odd. It feels like it's justified. It feels like this is what should be happening because you have to rally around one of these culturally held ideals like life. And what's interesting to me is that we don't put numbers into perspective, nor do we put those ideals into perspective. So currently, there's, let's say, around 1 million cases in a world that has 9 billion people. To get to 1 billion people, you need 999 million. 999 million get you to 1 billion. And our population on this earth is 9 billion plus. And it's not to devalue life. And I want to be clear about that. Matter of fact, let me take a moment right here, right now, to actually state, if you've made it this far, let me state, I am not suggesting that people go against what we're being told to do. Stay at home, abide by what's being told to happen right now, keep your family members safe, all of that. Everybody's life is important to who it's important to. And I'm clear about that. Everyone's life is important to who it's important to, which means your loved one's life is important to you and those who love them. And so do what's best for you and for those who you love. So let me stop to acknowledge that, because one of the things that I have seen happen when anyone is asking people to think critically is this idea that we are trying to get people to be unsafe, come out of their homes, whatever. That's not what the case is. And more specifically, it's because I don't think that the threat is not real. I think it's very real. I also think it's man-made. I also think it's opportunistic. And I also think that our reaction is propagandized. But I do think that the threat is real. It's also man-made. But man-made threats are also real threats. So like, I think that there has to be a balance where, again, like just asking people to think critically, that acknowledging that something is happening right now that we're not quite seeing. They're doing this, they're playing with one hand while the other hand is doing something else. Acknowledging that that phenomenon is happening is not saying not to take the necessary precautions. And considering that Black life is the least valued life in this country, definitely don't risk going against probably the closest thing that we've seen to martial law or any sort of major crackdown since pretty much the civil rights movements and riots and things of that sort, where they are really like locking down people and implementing laws and penalties and et cetera, right? So don't take those type of risks, but think critically, because we need to be watching out for what's going to happen. What I can assure you is that since the inception of this country, there has never been a recession or a depression that has landed the Black community in an upward position. We've always come out below. We've always struggled to maintain. So we should not put ourselves in positions to have anything more detrimental happen to us, but we should also not continue to walk forward without being very, very much aware of what the likely outcome is for our community as a whole, not the individual, our community as a whole, and also what is actually happening on a larger scale, and thinking about what's happening big picture. Because if they are walking back white civil liberties, they are definitely walking back Black civil rights. So just thinking about what some of these things look like. Okay, so I'm just pointing out that there are ways that we have subtly been introduced to the concept of these global outbreaks, global pandemics, a global health pandemic, specifically around a virus, specifically around death and a virus, despite what the actual numbers are beginning to show us and are beginning to, play out, right? And the call on this is how precious life is, right? every life matters. Every life is precious. Is it? Is it? I really am asking that question. And the reason why I'm really asking that question is because there are so many other facets of life that are wasted, killed, denied, that are not given this same type of attention and are just as preventable. So if we can prevent life by staying home, washing our hands, wearing a mask, and all of that, right? Are we not going to talk about how we can save lives by removing things out of our food? Are we not going to talk about saving lives by removing cancerous causing chemicals out of our homes? Like, all of these things are allowed, right? We're not going to talk about the different types of diseases that keep getting created and put out. We're not going to talk about the things that make us more susceptible to disease. We're not going to talk about the things that weaken our immune system so that our immune systems can't fight off disease. We're not going to talk about a whole plethora of, we're not going to talk about how heart disease and diabetes and all these things are killing us in large numbers on an annual basis. We're not going to talk about that, because this is different, right? But the end result of this is how precious life is. And yet on a day-to-day basis, we do not protect life. So I'm not going to assert that life is not precious. What I want to acknowledge is that there are many, many, many things that we don't do in order to preserve life, that we could do, that don't preserve life, that matter of fact harm life, and do so in large numbers. So I think it's important for us to recognize that it is a play on our emotions and on our beliefs, on a culturally held ideal that life is precious, when on a day-to-day basis, we don't value life. We don't value life daily. But there is a propagandized push using the idea of life versus death. I've seen people put out numbers of the amount of people who have recovered, and people are angry about that. Don't talk about how many people are recovering. This is not about that. We don't want to encourage people to go out and die. And I'm like, I'm baffled. We don't want to hear, I mean, even if you just want to have a more holistic idea, you don't want to talk about here's how many people have died today, and here's also how many people have recovered today. That having two sides of that coin is not useful information. We only want to hear about the people who have died. We only want to hear about that so that we can keep pushing this idea that all of this, you potentially losing your home, you struggling to eat, you not knowing where your next check is going to come from, all of this, all of the stress that you're going to go through, all of the civil liberties that they have just annihilated and crushed in the name of public safety, in the name of preserving life. But on a day-to-day basis, we are not preserving life in places that we could preserve life. And we've always put profit ahead of people. The water, pollution in the air, chemicals in our home, chemicals in our food, constantly pushing drugs on our streets, sex trafficking, the whole pharmaceutical industry. None of it preserves life. None of it preserves life. How concerned are we for life when the government is dropping trillions of dollars, and yet we still have kids who get their meals basically from school? Like Monday through Friday, they eat at school. don't necessarily have access to dinner, and might practically starve over the weekend. The issue isn't money. We just don't care about life. The government doesn't care about life. The government's never cared about life. I don't think there are any instances where we can really see that the government has cared significantly about life. So I just think that that's interesting. And so I see that in a lot of places, we've really struggled with this, with civil rights, civil liberties versus like public safety. And I just want to give you a couple of ideas, right? So I talked about 9/11, like literally to this day, damn near 20 years later, you can barely carry on certain things onto a plane. You walk through, you get your nuts felt, your breasts felt up, your hair felt, dogs sniffing up your ass. You got to dress all the way down, remove everything to get on a plane. Nobody thinks twice about this. It didn't matter how frustrating it was when it first came down, everyone has adjusted because humans are adaptable. So we have adapted to the way that we need to travel by air, to all the extra security. And we're okay with it because, you know, terrorist attacks. Think about the Snowden case, right? So if you're not really familiar with the Snowden case, the very brief piece of this was the CIA was basically monitoring people without a warrant and without their knowledge, which completely violates the Constitution. So Edward Snowden, as you know, he was an employee for the CIA. He outed them on this, right? Edward Snowden still can't come back into the country because basically the CIA felt like your civil liberties didn't really matter, right? And their reasoning was that that monitoring people without a warrant, without going to court and showing probable cause as to why they wanted to monitor this person and getting permission from the government to monitor them, and without knowledge of anybody other than the CIA knowing that they were doing this monitoring, this was all to prevent possible future terrorist attacks. And basically what they were saying was it was going to take too long to go through the system, so we just circumvented the system. It was going to take too long to bring forth evidence as to why we needed to monitor and record these people's conversations through the court system so that we could prove that we had a reason to be monitoring them. We're not even going to tell you a reason. We're not going to do a warrant. We're just going to monitor and record, right? And people agreed with this because safety, we don't want those terrorist attacks. So you feel like it's okay for the government to be monitoring you without your knowledge and without any probable cause? And then you got some people who are like, well, if I ain't doing nothing wrong, I don't care, right? But really? So privacy doesn't matter? Not in the name of public safety. Then you think about San Bernardino. So how many of you remember the San Bernardino terrorist attack, right? So I think it was like, don't quote me, but something like 12 people were killed, 14 people injured, something like that, right? So it was a terrorist attack. And basically they wanted to get into this guy's phone. But after so many attempts, the FBI wasn't able to get into his phone, and they actually permanently disabled the phone, right? So they wanted Apple to basically create an app to allow them to break into the phone, and Apple refused. I don't know how many of you remember this. So now they go to court because they want to make Apple create this, create a code. Like Apple has the ability to create the code, but Apple's like, no, because then you'd have the technology to break into anyone's phone. And so you have people who, for the most part, people were on the side of Apple, but you have people who were against that idea, saying Apple should go ahead and, create the app or whatever and let the FBI into this guy's phone. Because, public safety. So I think what's interesting to note, and I want to follow up with like one more point about this before I close out, because, I don't have no solutions. I try to, when I'm talking about sometimes problems, I really try to bring solutions. There's not a solution to this. I just really want to encourage us to think about what's happening. And I think that we're going to see this play out or as it continues to play out and as things continue to build, I'll have more to say. I really haven't had that much to say because I've been watching, and I feel like there's not enough information to have a strong conclusion. But what I will say is that it don't look good for us. I'm very concerned about how the Black community is going to come out on the other end of this. But I think that it's important for us to think about it because as I'm listening, now at this time that I'm recording this, there are reports that the people who are most affected by this proportionately are Black folks. Disproportionately, I should say. Right. So they were using Michigan as one example, like 40% of the coronavirus cases in Michigan are Black, even though Michigan is 10%. Now, Detroit is very Black, but Michigan is not. And so they're saying the majority of the cases are Black folks, right? So there's reports now just starting to come out saying that we are being highly affected by this, and that could be due to that really could bust wide open, some of the other disparities that we're facing, health disparities, economic disparities in opportunities, et cetera, right? So it could bust open and make room for those conversations. And I think if we are thinking about it right, then, and not necessarily just focusing on what's happening in the immediate, but, watching what's also going on in the peripheral or in the background, that we could really be able to make some strong pushes for the things that we need in order to level the playing field for our community. But not if we're not thinking about it, not if we're not strategic, not if we can't think critically or ask the tough questions or have the tough conversations. When you have had someone who has died from this virus, potentially from this virus or from this virus, it is a tough conversation to talk about some of the other things that are happening around us that we don't pay attention to on a regular basis. We want to pay attention to this one thing right here. And I talked about in one of my previous episodes about short-term versus long-term. We're not thinking long-term. We're always thinking short-term. We're always thinking in the immediate. And it feels like we should do that. It feels like you can't plan a year in advance or what it's going to look like for your family 5 years or what it's going to look like for your family in the next generation because you're thinking about making it to the end of the week. Or maybe you're thinking about making it to the end of the month. So while many of us are here thinking about how we're just going to survive this virus, we're not thinking about how we're going to come out on the other end, because the reality of it is that under this current virus, now I'm not going to say what they're going to plan their next outbreak, but under this current virus, the vast majority of people are living. You are 98, 99% likely to live if you catch the coronavirus. Matter of fact, you could be asymptomatic and have it and don't even know, right? Don't have no issues at all. My point in that is that we're not thinking about how we're going to come out on the other end of this. Not enough of our leaders are talking about how we're going to come out on the other end of this. We're so focused in on what's happening right now that we're not thinking about the future. And that concerns me. Because historically, if we're not thinking about that, what happens to us on the other end is we are further and further away. We were already on track to have zero wealth by 2053. It's 2020, and with what just happened on the global economy, we could have moved that timeline up exponentially if we're not thinking, if we're not careful. And of course, this is all in the name of life, the life that we don't care about under regular everyday circumstances. And I want us to care about life, but I want us to care about all of life in a holistic way. And I'm not seeing that happen. So I just want to make that point. I'm gonna make my last point here, but I want to make that point because people like to run away with stuff. And my hope is that we can have that dialogue without you running away on something crazy, right? So this isn't a devaluation of life, but it's an acknowledgement that as a community, as a people, as a country, we do actually devalue life. So the fact that they're trying to use life and death as the scare tactic is really interesting to me, and not in a good way. So the last thing I do want to talk about is fear and placebo. And I want to acknowledge how powerful our brain really is. there are stories that exist and there are studies that have been done that acknowledge what a brain can really do when the belief is strong enough, when the fear is strong enough, when the anxiety is strong enough, right? If you think about someone having a panic attack or someone having an anxiety attack, things of that sort, oftentimes they could be reacting to things that aren't even happening, but the physiological response is very real, right? If someone's having a panic attack, it doesn't mean that they are actually in any physical danger, but they could be sensing panic so strong that their heart is beating, they're breaking out in sweats, they're frantic, they're incoherent, and you can have that strong of a reaction because of something that took place in your mind, even if it's not the reality. And I want us to acknowledge that, right? So don't believe me, go look up studies. Fear, well, before you even get to fear, the power of the mind itself is very powerful. So let's talk about a way that doesn't include fear, the placebo effect. The placebo effect is based on giving someone something that doesn't really exist, but making them believe it does and watching the change. It's often referred to in medicine. So you could be doing a study and I can tell you, I'm getting ready to give you a cure for your blood pressure. Your blood pressure is elevated and I'm about to give you this pill and I want you to take this pill. And when you take this pill, your blood pressure is going to come down. And let me tell you something, if your blood pressure stays up that high, it's going to be looking real bad for you. So take this pill, take it daily, and you're going to see your blood pressure come down. In that study, what they are most likely to do is give some people the medicine and some people a placebo, and then they're going to study the effects. And in a lot of studies, obviously not every study, but in a lot of studies, people who have the placebo see improvement in their condition, even though they weren't given the actual medicine. Why does that happen? Because they believed they were given the medicine, so they believed that it was working, and their body responded accordingly. So this is a real thing. The placebo effect is a real thing. And it is an example that highlights the power of your mind in a way that can improve your condition. It can also make your condition worse. Fear can make things happen or make things worse, even when there's not an issue. So you could, first of all, we just came out of flu season, right? So they ain't talking flu numbers right now, but I ain't even going to go there. You could have coughed or sniffled or felt a scratch in your throat, and you're so afraid you finna die from coronavirus that you have caused yourself to be all types of sick. Now you think your head hurt. Oh my God, do I feel warm? Oh my goodness. Oh my God. Oh my goodness. And you causing yourself to go into a panic. It's interesting because which radio? I think it was CBS that did like a little round table, and they have 4 women on from different parts of the world that were coronavirus survivors. And some of these women were talking about the fear of them having it was worse than them actually having it. The fear, it was just so bad. They were so afraid for their life that it can cause other physiological changes to happen. You so afraid you're gonna cough, your throat start tickling, and you like, oh my goodness, forget the fact that it's allergy season. Right now, we're in spring, officially in spring. Weather is warming up, bees are out pollinating stuff, birds are moving things around, pollen is in the air. I'm sniffling myself. I didn't sneeze all day today because I was enjoying some outside time and I have allergies. But if you're so afraid, you can have be having allergies or having sinuses. You could have had the actual flu. You could have had a number of things, and you just send yourself into this tizzy. Yeah, I said tizzy. I said that. But I want us to think about the power of our mind and recognize how real it is. People have died because of their mind. There was this there was this guy who got locked inside of a freezer, and he basically died, even though the freezer wasn't on. But he kept thinking he was getting so cold. He was getting so cold, right? And what was interesting was and I can't remember how, I want to say that he was like scratching something in on the freezer, right, trying to like record his last thought or whatever, which is how they know. But he was basically like, it's getting colder, it's getting colder. And he was in a cold place, but the freezer wasn't actually on. Like, so he pretty much killed himself thinking that he was freezing to death. He had gotten himself into so much fear. That's a true story. But it's just interesting to recognize how powerful our brain is, and the fear of death, which so far isn't really the imminent threat, is at least for most people, right? So certainly if you have a pre-existing condition, certainly if you're older, there are certain people who are at risk, that maybe it is, a big deal, but there are a lot of people that aren't, and quite a few people, again, that are recovering. But if you are so fearful, it can place you into a different type of situation, right? So again, coming back to propaganda, thinking about how propaganda is used to suggest and influence us in ways that really prey upon our emotions and can really prey upon our fear, and using these horror stories to justify actions, making sure that we discredit anything that is contradictory to the narrative or the story that they want, and how we tie all these things to really thinking about these culturally held ideas like life and freedom and security. We are willing to give up our civil liberties in the name of security and in the name of life. Whether or not security is a real issue, whether or not life or death is a real issue. And so I'm going to end on that. Again, I don't have any suggestions. This is not about any of that. This is really just a conversation around what it looks like to implement long-standing propaganda, and to think about the way that we have been propagandized over a course of several years, with the way that our actions are coming out, with the way that propaganda campaigns come out. I just laid them out for you. I did not parallel them to what's happening in the coronavirus situation. I parallel them to what happened in 9/11. But I think that if you think through those 6 ways, right, creating a common enemy, claiming that unity will bring us victory, appealing to our culturally held beliefs, giving examples of depravity in order to strengthen our response, you know, discrediting unfavorable or contradictory information, and then really pushing out these horror stories to justify the actions. When we think through those ways, do we see that playing out today in the news? And are we allowing our fears to control the outcomes without acknowledging how powerful our brains actually are in our physiological responses? And so my final thought that I want to leave us with in this conversation is, how many of our civil liberties and civil rights are we willing to walk back in the name of public safety? And that's something we should be thinking about, because in the same way that many of these procedures and policies and pieces of legislation have never been walked back from 9/11, I wholeheartedly believe that the legislations and the policies that are going to come out are going to further walk back our civil liberties, and are not going to be reversed. So we're going to walk into a new level of with fewer liberties and fewer rights, in the name of public safety, in the name of life, in the name of security, whether that's warranted or not. And I just want us to think about that, because for our community historically, these types of things have been detrimental to us. So my ask of you, or my closing thought is for you to think about these things, and not to say that you have to have an answer, right? But I think to give perspective and for us to be aware, and to start thinking strategically about what it's going to look like for us to come out on the other end, to make sure that we have people that are fighting for the legislation and the policies that are going to affect us in ways that are beneficial and not cause further harm. So those are some of the things that I want to leave you with. And that's all I got for y'all today. So I just want to thank you for joining me on another episode of Boss Up with BBI, as we dig into all things money and mindset in the Black community, even when we are pushing the limits of our critical thinking. All right, y'all, until next time, peace.